Are we trying to forget from whence we came? Or perhaps, more pointedly, do we, especially our young people, really know the roots from whence we came? I submit that we take this opportunity to look back and reacquaint ourselves with our painful but illustrious and significant past in order to chart a new, peaceful, and wholesome course for the future. In the Akan language, as you heard earlier, of Ghana, there is this term Sankofa that translates in English to go back and take. The Akan people use the Andinkra symbol represented the same idea. Quote, it is not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten. One version of this symbol is similar to the Eastern symbol of a heart, and another version is that of a bird with its head turned backwards, taking an egg off its back. It symbolizes one taking from the past what is good and bringing it into the present in order to make positive progress through the benevolent use of knowledge. Visually and symbolically, Sankofa is expressed as a mythical bird that flies forward while looking backward with an egg symbolizing the future in its mouth. For this reason, I have chosen Sankofa as my refrain this evening, as I hope to take you on a short, selected journey through our history that must continue to chart the course of our future. Sankofa teaches us that we must go back to our roots in order to move forward. That is, we should reach back and gather the best of what our past has to teach us so that we can achieve our full potential as we move forward. So why Sankofa? Because we must know that in the early 1500s, African men, women, and children were shipped as slaves from West African ports in countries like Nigeria and Benin to the Caribbean, as slavery became the major origin of income for Europeans there. Today, if you go to the town of Badgery, it is a tourist center known for its historic location, scenery, and cultural significance that holds a haunting reminder of the horrors that took place during the trafficking of human slavery. There are still areas of the town that have museums, buildings, and old relics, such as the slave chains, the old missionary cemetery, the slave markets, and the slave ports built for the transport of slaves in the 16th century. Why Sankofa, you ask? Because we may have forgotten that our ancestors once lived as free men and women in Africa, masters of the greatest civilizations before they were hunted like animals, kidnapped against their will, forcibly placed in detention enclosures, a slave barracoon, shackled with chains, branded and jammed into tight unsanitary spaces in the crowded hull of ramshackle boats for months at a time on the dangerous seas across an infamous Middle Passage, bound for these islands in the Caribbean as products to be sold at auction. So why Sankofa? Because we must remember that the transatlantic slave trade resulted in a vast and as yet still unknown loss of life for African captives during their transport to the New World. Millions did not survive the journey. More died soon upon their arrival. Those who survived faced an oppressive life in a country where they couldn't even keep their own names. The amount of life lost in the actual procurement of slaves remain a mystery, but may equal or exceed the amount actually enslaved, and that the savage nature of the trade led to the destruction of individuals and cultures. Why Sankofa? Because we must know that the flow of the foreign merchandise into our region and our present lust for same has an eerie resemblance to the practice that provided fuel for the slave trade. In letters written by the Mankungo Nzinga Mbembe Afonso of the Kingdom of Congo to the King João III of Portugal, he writes that Portuguese merchandise flowing in is what is fueling the trade of Africans. He requests the King of Portugal to stop sending merchandise, but should only send missionaries. In one of his letters, he writes, and I quote, "Each day, the traders are kidnapping our people, children of this country, sons of our nobles and vassals, even people of our own family. The corruption and the poverty are so widespread that our land is entirely depopulated. We need in this kingdom only priests and school teachers and no merchandise, unless it is wine and flour for mass. It is our wish that this kingdom not be a place for the trade of the transport of slaves. He continues, many of our subjects eagerly lust after Portuguese merchandise that your subjects have brought into this dominion. To satisfy this inordinate appetite, they seize many of our black free subjects. They sell them after having taken these prisoners to the coast secretly at night. As soon as the captives are in the hands of white men, they are branded with a red-hot iron, unquote. Today, we are rapidly becoming slaves of another kind, consumer slaves, to cheap, inferior merchandise and trinkets dumped on our shores by countries who are prepared to enslave us economically. Why Sankofa? Because we must not forget our ancestors upon arrival in these shores were placed in seasoning camps throughout the Caribbean, where 33% of them died in the first year. They were tortured for the purpose of breaking them, like the practice of breaking horses, and conditioning them to their new lot in life, after which they were sold like a heifer, a bull, or a steer at auctions at places like one we now proudly revere as our Independence Square. What irony, our Independence Square, a place where we once sold our ancestors as slaves and personal property to work in cotton-picking fields of plantations of cane and tobacco, working for less than nothing. As a reformed Abraham Lincoln would say, and he would go on to say, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. Why Sankofa? Because our forefathers must tell their own story. Slavery can only be described by those who have experienced it, not by liberal historians who saw slavery as perhaps the Negro's necessary transition to civilization. When we are already a highly civilized people, our economists who have tried to assess slavery by estimating how much money was spent on slaves for food and medical care. But can this describe the reality of slavery as it was to a human being who lived inside it? Are the conditions of slavery as important as the existence of slavery itself? John Little, a former slave, wrote, and I quote, "They say slaves are happy because they laugh and are merry. I myself and 3 or 4 others have received 200 lashes in the day and had our feet in fetters. Yet at night we would sing and dance and make others laugh at the rattling of our chains. Happy men we must have been. We did it to keep down trouble and to keep our hearts from being completely broken." That is as true as the gospel. Just look at it now. Not that we were happy. Why Sankofa? Because we must know the truth about the black family. There are those who will tell you that slavery destroyed the black family. And so the black condition was blamed on family frailty rather than on poverty, injustice, and prejudice. Blacks without families, they say, helpless, lacking kinship and identity. They argued would have no will to resist. But interviews with ex-slaves done in the 1930s showed a different story, which George Warwick summarizes in From Sundown to Sunup. And I quote, "The slave community acted like a generalized extended kinship system in which all adults look after all children, and there was little division between my children for whom I'm responsible and your children for whom you're responsible. A kind of family relationship in which older children have great responsibility for caring for younger siblings is obviously more functionally integrative and useful for slaves than the pattern of sibling rivalry and often dislike that frequently comes out of contemporary middle-class nuclear families composed of highly individuated persons. Indeed, the activity of the slaves in creating patterns of family life that were functionally integrative did more than merely prevent the destruction of personality. It was part and parcel, as we shall see, of the social process out of which came Black pride, Black identity, Black culture, the Black community, and of course, Black rebellion. Old letters and records dug out by historian Herbert Gutman, the Black family in slavery and freedom, showed the stubborn resistance of the slave family to pressures of disintegration. A woman wrote to her son from whom she had been separated for 20 years, quote, "I long to see you in my old age. Now, my dear son, I pray you come to see your dear old mother. I love you, Cato. You love your mother. You are my only son," unquote. And a man wrote to his wife, sold away from him with their children, quote, "Send me some of the children's here in a separate paper with their names on the paper. I had rather anything had happened to me most than ever to have been parted from you and the children. Laura, I do love you the same," unquote. Going through records of slave marriages, Gutman found how high the incidence of marriage among slave men and women was and how stable their marriages were. He found a birth register that showed stable kin networks, steadfast marriages, unusual fidelity, and resistance to forced marriages. Slaves hung on determinedly to their selves, to their love of family, their wholeness. This family solidarity carried them into the 20th century. And why Sankofa, you ask? Because the world must be reminded that the plantation economies of the New World were built on slave labor. 70% of the enslaved people brought to the New World were used to produce sugar, the most labor-intensive crop. The rest were employed harvesting cotton, coffee, and tobacco, and in some cases, in mining. The West Indian colonies of the European powers were some of their most important possessions, so they went to extremes to protect and retain them. By far, the most financially profitable West Indian colonies in the 1800s belonged to the United Kingdom. After entering the sugar colony business late, British naval supremacy and control over key islands such as Jamaica, Trinidad, the Leeward Islands, and Barbados, and the territory of British Guyana gave it an important edge over all competitors. Our own Eric Williams, in his writings, tried to show the contributions of Africans on the basis of profits from the slave trade and slavery, and the employment of those profits to finance England's industrialization process. He argues that the enslavement of Africans was an essential element to the Industrial Revolution, and that British wealth is a result of slavery. Let me repeat that. British wealth is a result of slavery. Karl Marx, in his influential economic history of capitalism, Das Kapital, claimed, quote, "The turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of blackskins signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production," unquote. He argued that the slave trade was part of what he termed the primitive accumulation of European capital, the non-capitalist accumulation of wealth that preceded the creation and created the financial conditions for Britain's industrialization. Why Sankofa? Because it is important for us to know where violence in the Black family originated. There is a direct correlation between the brutal and inhumane treatment meted out to slaves and the violence exhibited by Black men today. On large plantations, overseers were responsible for disciplining slaves and meting out punishment that could range from fairly mild reproofs to brutal discipline, including whippings and brandings carried out on men, women, and children in full view of each other. Even pregnant women were not exempt from beatings. The overseer would force her to lie face down with her belly in a hole in the ground to protect his property, of course, while he beat the hell out of her. Some slaves were forced to wear shackles or hand irons, a kind of cage fastened to their face. Another punishment was hanging a slave by the thumbs for hours. Of course, the worst punishment was to be sold away from one's family, usually to a harsher owner. Before I close, I want to go back to one of the oldest stories of slavery. a story found in the Bible. I want us to ponder seriously these verses found in Genesis and see their significance and relevance to us as a people, whose history is also linked to slavery. The story of Joseph is quite familiar to most. Joseph was sold by his brothers to merchants going to Egypt. He was sold and lived as a slave in Egypt. After some time, he was able to save Egypt from a terrible famine and likewise save his family from hunger and invited them to live with him in Egypt. And so that is why Joseph talks to his brother in these terms, quote, "God sent me before you to assure the survival of your race on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." Genesis 45:7. And the evil you planned to do me has by God's design been turned to good, to bring about the present result, the survival of a numerous people. Genesis 50:20. Could these words found in the very first book of the Bible be a fulfilling prophecy for our African ancestry, sold into slavery, and our present survival as a Caribbean civilization? We need to think seriously about it. So finally, why Sankofa? Because according to Dr. Ralph Gonsalves, Prime Minister St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and I quote, "Who we have become is partly a result of our collective history and partly because of our individual disposition or conduct." Derek Walcott, the literary giant from St. Lucia and the Caribbean, has correctly reminded us that our history contributes fundamentally to the knowledge of our individual selves and our society. That knowledge, he insists, is potentially a creative force, but if misused, leads to recriminations and despair or remorse and nostalgia. The purpose of history is not merely to have us look back. If that alone is done, we would become mired in the past whilst other nations are dashing onward, forward to a productive future. It is true, as our own celebrated poet Daniel Williams affirms, that the present is the past. But he equally and accurately proclaims that of all time, only the future is ours to desecrate. Our principal task is not to desecrate the future, and the knowledge of our history is vital in this enterprise. But the avoidance of damaging the future begins in the present. Each individual who is listening or not listening to me today has a vital role to play in this regard. Each individual can make a difference, particularly if he or she acts in solidarity with others. And in this collective solidarity, the society becomes energized and mobilized to work for necessary and desirable change. So I end where I started. Ignorance hides in silence, and the only way it can be obliterated is by transparency that exposes the issue at hand and dialogues or actions that bring resolution. Now, let us once and for all time break the silence